Northeast Texas, the black, waxy prairie, 1828. Wild, wide open country, big, harsh, and lonely. No houses, no roads, just a broad expanse of prairie grass, scrub brush, trees, and Indians. One tribe or another had lived here for hundreds and perhaps thousands of years. Kenneth Bush of Roxton has made a long-time hobby of collecting arrowheads. He says he doesn't dig for them. He just picks them up after they've fallen out of the banks of the channel. His collection contains arrowheads that were made upwards of 10,000 years ago. The age of arrowheads is determined by their point type. The authority is Overstreet's annual publication, Indian Arrowhead Identification. Using that as his reference, Kenneth has determined that his collection includes arrowheads that were made 10 to 12,000 years ago. He's shown here holding a Plainview point that he just found along the channel. He says the point is around 8,000 years old, according to Overstreet. Needless to say, this was Indian country, and it had been for a long time. The Caddos were here when the first white settlers arrived. The Caddos were not warriors, they were farmers, and just like their white successors, they farmed the river bottom. They even grew cotton and spun threads. Two tiny rivers, later known as the North Sulphur and South Sulphur, provided a source for water. A Caddo village was located in this bend of the North Sulphur, about 3.5 miles north of Enloe. This was once a great place to find arrowheads, but they're gone. All that remains are pieces of flint rock that were chipped away during the process of making arrowheads. The prairie had a lot of grassland. There were trees, but they were scrawny by timber country standards. The underbrush was as thick as the hair on an Alaskan husky. There was an abundance of scrawny trees that were obviously put on earth for their utility, certainly not their beauty. They were thorny and ugly. The wood was a mixture of yellow and orange in color. The French had seen the Indians making bows from the tough, resilient wood and named it Bodark, wood of bows. The Caddos traded bows and Bodark wood to tribes in Arkansas in exchange for flint rock needed for making arrows. It's said that the thorny tree was the inspiration for barbed wire. Well, maybe. The little North Sulphur runs along the tree line. It's nothing more than a dry creek bed today, but it's still the county line between Delta and Lamar counties. White settlers began arriving in the 1820s. They'd been attracted by the offer of free land. Free land was one thing. Surviving in this stark, forbidding frontier was something else. It took emotional and physical strength to make it. The lifestyle was primitive. Settlers lived out of their wagons and in tents until they could build a cabin. The only sources of supply were trading posts located many miles away. A shopping trip could take 3 or 4 days or more. The first settlers to come here were rugged, self-sufficient individuals. They had to be to stand the isolation. Alone in a sparsely settled area, they felt vulnerable, and they were on edge with the Indians living nearby. The Caddos were not ruthless people. In fact, their encounter with the first Spanish conquistadors had been very friendly. The Caddos called them Texas, the Caddo word for friend, that eventually became Tejas, and then Texas. Without doubt, the Caddos were not pleased when they saw the white men moving in, but it's unlikely that they sought to drive them away. Nonetheless, a classic clash of cultures was brewing. Eventually, it would escalate into violent confrontations. Settlers wanted a safe haven when things got rough. To provide that, they built Fort Lyday north of Ben Franklin. Civilian forts were common in the mid-19th century. Nothing remains of the old fort today, but we can imagine that it looked much like Fort Parker near Enloe, Texas. Fort Lyday became a busy sanctuary. There are many tales of bloody clashes between the white settlers and the Indians. On one occasion, the settlers chased the Indians to the south of a river. There, Indian men, women, and children were killed. That seems horribly uncivilized, but we have to consider the dynamic of a frontier that had no social structure. The Caddos were decimated by these skirmishes. They probably realized that they were embroiled in a kind of war they could not win. White Rock, Texas is a peaceful little community located midway between Greenville and Wolf City. Nearby is a heavily wooded area known as Black Cat Thicket. It was here, in 1838, that the last battle between the settlers and the Indians took place. Hostilities subsided after the battle at Black Cat. The Indians were weakened by the white man's diseases and, without doubt, weary of the fight. Eventually, they would be relocated to the Indian Nation where they remain today. The Caddo tribal headquarters are in Binger, Oklahoma, a few miles southwest of Oklahoma City. By 1836, the population of Texas had swelled to 50,000, and relations with Mexico had grown tense. That's not surprising. Texas had been settled by strong, independent people. They were not going to be subject to the restrictions of Mexican rule. When Houston's army defeated Santa Anna's forces at San Jacinto on April 21, 1836, Texas freed itself from Mexico. It had become an independent republic. It remained a republic for only 9 years. In 1845, it joined the Union as the 28th state. That wouldn't last long either. 16 years later, against the advice of Sam Houston, the voters ratified an ordinance of secession. Houston was a U.S. senator at the time and wanted to preserve the Union. His stance was unpopular to say the least, and he was not reelected. Texas joined the Confederate States of America. Not all the citizens of Delta County were sympathetic to the Confederacy.
You all don't realize, even when I was growing up here, it wasn't very popular to be from the North. You think we had like old man John Powers and 2 or 3 like that, and hell, the rest of these people just didn't have nothing much to do with them if you was from the North, even when I was a kid.
The Civil War raged on for 4 bloody years. 650,000 men lost their lives. Very little combat occurred on Texas soil, but the state suffered an enormous number of casualties. The Texans fought bravely and effectively for the South. It seemed improbable that young Texans would be so quick to fight in a war that seemed not to involve them, but it did involve them. Their families had come from southern states, so there was a natural allegiance to the South.
And they didn't just bring their families with them, they brought their points of view with them. Not all these people were friendly towards slavery. Many of these people were very independent of that lifestyle and were very proud of their rugged individualism. But all these men were led in their conviction that they were best at determining their own government, the direction that government would take. The man who would hold all this together was Sam Bell Maxey, had been born in Kentucky in 1825, educated at the United States Military Academy at West Point.
In 1861, Maxey was serving in the state Senate. He resigned his office and raised a militia. It was known as Lamar Rifles of Light Infantry. Other local militia joined Maxey's group to form the 9th Texas Regiment.
Camp Rusk, Texas, Lamar County, 1860. Today it's part of Delta County, but back then it was still in Lamar County. Maxey began drilling his regiment there, 1,000 men. Takes a lot to sustain a body of 1,000 men, even for one day. He had 3 mills in the country grinding corn each day to feed that 1,000 men. He was butchering 12 head of cattle each day to sustain those 1,000 men.
They trained here about 1.5 miles southwest of Ben Franklin. The camp was named in honor of General Thomas J. Rusk, a Republic of Texas leader. The 9th Texas fought bravely in Tennessee at Shiloh, Perryville, and Murfreesboro. They moved south and fought at Chickamauga and Altoona, Georgia. The 9th Texas sustained heavy casualties. Eventually, they surrendered at Spanish Fort, Alabama, a month after Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, Virginia.
And at the surrender, as the 9th Texas filed by, Charlie Matthews of Paris, Texas, took the flag of the 9th Texas down, concealed it in his shirt bosom, and kept that flag where for many years after the war it was displayed at the Maxey House in Paris, Texas.
Their war was over, and the South had lost. But for many, the war would never end. President Andrew Johnson agreed to grant amnesty to anyone who would take an oath of allegiance to the Union. Sherwood Toone's grandfather didn't take kindly to that idea.
He was one of 20 that wouldn't come in and take the oath of allegiance down here in East Texas. If you had your history book of Titus County, you'd see it in there. I've got one. They hid out in Caney Creek and Sulphur Bottom for, I think it's 7 years before he come in and took the oath of allegiance. And he had an uncle down there that was a doctor. He's pretty prominent, and he finally got him to come in. And then there in one case, said they were eating some sardines at a store at a little old place called Snow Hill. It's even gone now. The Yankee soldier come in and reached over their shoulder and picked up this can of sardines. He was with the Army occupation. My grandfather knocked him in the head with a cotton pea.
Fortunately, the soldier was not badly injured. Many of those who fought in the war for the Confederacy hated the Yankees for the rest of their lives.
Well, he never did get over it. You could get them old timers, them old Confederate soldiers together, and there wasn't but one war in their way of thinking. And they never could get over it. Bubba Justice over here at Howland, which is a great-grandson of Uncle Jesse. One year they went to an old soldiers' reunion in Florida, my grandfather and Uncle Jesse. And then went, and right at the last, it showed a Yankee soldier and a Confederate soldier shaking hands. And Uncle Jesse Justice got up and threw his chair through the screen. Cost him $300. And the last time I talked to his great-grandson over there, he told me, he said, "You know, I've still got that chair."
Confederate states were required to ratify the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves. All but one state quickly did that. The lone holdout was Texas. The Confederacy was under military control. General Gordon Granger was in charge of Texas. He issued a proclamation that freed all Texas slaves on June 19, 1865. Insult was about to be added to injury. The South was entering 22 years of misery. The Reconstruction period was difficult, to say the least. Much of the Old South had been destroyed. Confederate money was totally worthless. The South and its plantation lifestyle was truly gone with the wind. And to make matters worse, they had to put up with an invasion of Yankee carpetbaggers. The new Yankee-ized South was just too much for many Southerners, and they chose to simply get out. Maybe they could find a better place. If not better, at least it'd be different. A lot of them opted to go to Texas. Many of them had relatives already living in this area. Neighbors in the Old South would become neighbors in Texas.
You take right around here at Enloe, the Grosses, that is Vern Gross's bond, and the Stocktons, and the Toons, and the Sandridge, and the McCutcheons, and all of them were from, they always told me a mile of each other in Alabama.
A little town used to sit just beyond the county equipment barn. It's a pasture today, but years before Enloe was established, Unishi was the center of community activity.
Unishi was a little hamlet, I guess you'd call it, about 2 miles from Enloe, and happened to be the place I was born and raised. Also the place my mother was born and raised. At one time, it was a pretty good-sized little place, had about 200 people in it. It had a gin, a post office, a store, school, and a church. The church I remember was Methodist Protestant Church, where I went to church and as long as it was open out there. And at that time, when they finally closed it, well, we had to move our membership to Enloe. But Unishi was a pretty nice little hamlet out just 2 miles out of Enloe.
The move from the Old South was hardly a weekend trip. It was an arduous journey, mostly by riverboat. It ended at Jefferson, Texas. There, the families offloaded their personal belongings and headed northwest for Unishi. The trip from Jefferson to Unishi took several days. Jefferson was a port city in those days, thanks to Caddo Lake. It was a hub of mercantile activity, and it was the source of supply for Unishi merchants.
See, my grandpa Wilkinson, after he got up here and settled down, he run a freight line from Unishi to Jefferson, Texas. Yeah, before the railroad ever come.
Railroad companies were busy laying track to the west. Eventually, it became possible to make most of the trip from the Old South to Unishi by train.
But I can remember Granddad Barry Conyas telling this story. But he was a very young tot. And they were on the train with his parents coming back from Alabama to Texas. And it was somewhere up around Fort Smith, Arkansas, that there was one hellacious battle going on between the Indians, soldiers, Rangers. He said he didn't know what it was, but there's an awful lot of shooting going on. The bullets were coming through the windows on the train, and they just nearly hit his mama in the head. And she was holding little Austin in her lap. And this had to be in the early 1885 area, because Austin was only a few weeks old when all this happened. But they made it through the battle. Where they got off the train, I don't know, but they settled somewhere between Enloe and Mount Joy.
Well, it sounds as if there may have been a little business for Judge Isaac Parker, the famous hanging judge in Fort Smith. Unishi was a happening place. Andrew Jackson and his brother operated a mule-powered cotton gin. There were 2 churches, a school, a drugstore, a grocery, and a general merchandise store. In the early history of cotton ginning, farmers who could afford the investment built a gin on their farm and served all the farmers in the area. So it was with the first gin in Unishi. Andrew Jackson's gin was located on his farm north of Unishi.
Well, it was an old mule power, didn't have a motor in it, and had one stand. There's a big stand. You get the cotton out of the wagon in a basket, set it upstairs, and then a man feeds it with his hand, feeds the stand with a hand. Then they had a press, of course. A mule pulled it. Had a big iron deal with, threads on it. They pull this mule and tighten it up. And I was just a kid, but I remember that part of it. And it had sails in it that was 12 by 12 hewed with an axe. And then, of course, it's put together with bodark pins. It's a stout building.
As with all frontier towns, the churches played a significant role in Unishi's community life.
I was born in 19, and I remember the church at Unishi, but that was about all right. And when they moved it, they come to the Methodist and Baptist in Enloe. And what happened to the church building, I don't know.
Meadie Wilkinson Toon remembered those days in Unishi in a note she left behind.
Many things from my days at Old Unishi have always lingered in my heart. The pleasant school days, those wonderful concerts, the spelling bees. What a class we had in algebra with Mr. Smith as our teacher. The great snowball we made, also while Mr. Smith was our teacher. I remember the big dinners upstairs in Uncle John Costin's drugstore, and I remember how we worked fixing our community Christmas tree. And I will never forget the play parties we kids enjoyed, and the old brush arbor meetings. But dearest of all was the selection of an organ for our church, and the meeting held just before.
I still think about Unishi every Christmas Eve, and I think, now, one time I was getting ready to go to the Christmas tree, and I was thrilled to death. One time, Brother Nunn, who used to be the pastor at Unishi, he came home with us for supper that night, and I thought he never would stop eating. I was so anxious to go to the Christmas tree. I thought we were going to be late because he won't get through eating. Well, he finally finished, and we went on and got there in plenty of time.
Singing conventions were much in vogue in those days, and Miss Lula Mullins was a fan.
Well, everybody would be there that liked to sing, and everybody'd sing. But they'd have a bunch of people that were good singers to do most of the singing, like the Bridges bunch. They were all wonderful singers. Mr. Hicks and the Bridges, Annie Mae played the piano, and once in a while Gala Burns would play it. But I always wanted Annie Mae to play because I thought she played better than anybody.
It's hard to imagine a life without radio, movies, and television, but that was it. So people made their own entertainment with various games and competitions. It was a hard life, but in the context of that period, they had a good time. The Old Liberty School was located here, a little over a mile north of present-day Enloe. We have to imagine a tiny school building set down in a broad expanse of prairie grass. Children walked to school along trails and rough roads that cut through the blue-stemmed grass. In her brief history of Enloe, Miss Liddy Enloe Moore called them the worst roads this side of perdition. Old Liberty was organized as a literary school in the 1870s. After a school was established in Unishi in 1888, the Old Liberty students began going to school there. In 1893, Old Liberty was reorganized by petition of 30 families who lived closer to Old Liberty than Unishi.
Old Liberty, you know where Old Liberty was? The old school. My dad went to school there when he was a boy. And they moved him there to, out here where the county barn is. Unishi, Old Liberty, they moved to Unishi. And they run that school for years, even after we had school here.
The 19th century had brought technological advancements, such things as telephones, telegraph, and the steam engine. The Industrial Revolution had arrived, and the iron horse would bring about a remarkable transformation. When the Texas Midland Railroad Company decided to lay tracks from Paris to Ennis, they bypassed Unishi. It signaled the beginning of the end for the thriving little community. The law required that a railroad company put a station every 5 miles or so. Many Texas towns and cities began as a station on the railroad. So it was with Enloe.
My great-granddad came to the Delta County area on December the 25th, 1869. He moved first into the Lake Creek area. I don't know how long he stayed there, but it couldn't have been much more than a year, because in 1870 I have the first tax records where he paid taxes on a place, and that was in where Enloe sits today. He donated or sold, he did not donate, he sold the land to the railroad when they came through, and that's where the name of Enloe came from.
The firm of Tart and Moore laid out a plan for a city. This copy of their plan indicates their rather ambitious projections. Lexi and Pearl Streets were to be the business streets, so they were laid out 80 feet wide. The other streets were 60 feet wide. Lexi did become the main street, but Pearl was never fully developed. To help with our orientation in a present-day context, Howland Street ran from the community center to the Baptist church. The Methodist church is located at the corner of Lexi and Robinson. Each lot was 25 by 140 feet with 20-foot alleyways. Edward Howland Robinson Green built the railroad. He was the son of Hetty Green, one of the richest women in America. The streets running north and south were named after members of his family. The streets running east and west were named after members of Hetty Green's family. The businessmen of Unishi could see the advantages of close proximity to the railroad. Rail transportation was an obvious boon to the cotton industry, so J.A. Jackson moved his ginning operation to Enloe. Gradually, Unishi faded away. August 15, 1896. It was an exciting day in Enloe. It was on that day that the very first train moved through town. Why, the depot hadn't even been built. No matter, the age of transportation had arrived, and Enloe was about to become a town.
The Enloe Post Office was established in 1897. Jerry High was the postmaster. The first store was a grocery store. Albert Burns and Bud Huey built it. Dr. J.L. Coker opened the first drugstore. Melvie Smith worked for him. And then after Melvie learned the trade, he took over and carried on for about 40 years. He always said, take care of the pennies and the dollars will take care of themselves. He was a frugal man. He amassed a fortune and became one of the most beloved and important men in the community. I guess everyone loved him. He never heard a bad word about him at all. Enloe grew rapidly. A newspaper, the Enloe Enterprise, was published by Custard and J.L. Small. The advertisements in the 1906 edition, we had 2 drugstores, 4 mercantile stores, a blacksmith shop, and an agricultural implement dealer. We had a photograph gallery, a barber shop, hotels, cafes, doctor's offices were added later on. Enloe was buzzing with activity.